Imagine coming home after a long day to find strangers in your backyard, partying like they own the place. For months, she put up with it, until one bold move changed everything. Margaret never wanted to be that kind of neighbor. She wasn't the type to glare through the blinds or file complaints over trivial things. In fact, she had always believed in community, waving at passers-by, chatting with folks at the mailbox, even sharing fresh tomatoes from her garden with the couple next door. But respect, that was something she valued above all else. And lately, it seemed like nobody on this street had any. It started small. A few weeks into summer, Margaret noticed wet footprints on her patio in the mornings. At first, she thought maybe a raccoon had gotten into the water, until she saw a crumpled soda can floating in the deep end. Then there were the towels, strangers' towels draped over her lounge chairs, as if her backyard was some sort of resort. She didn't want to jump to conclusions, so she let it go. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe some kids had gotten confused, thinking it was a community pool. But then, one evening just before sunset, she caught them. A trio of teenagers, giggling as they waded through her pool, completely oblivious to the fact that they were trespassing. Margaret didn't scream, didn't make a fuss. She simply opened her sliding glass door and stepped outside. The moment they saw her, the color drained from their faces. "Oh, we thought nobody was home," one of them stammered, scrambling to get out. Margaret folded her arms. "That's the problem, isn't it?" They took off without another word, leaving behind their dripping towels and an opened bag of chips that had spilled all over her deck. She spent the next 20 minutes scooping soggy crumbs out of the water, muttering under her breath. She assumed that would be the end of it, that they'd learned their lesson. She was wrong. By the following week, the problem had escalated. Now, it wasn't just teenagers sneaking in after dark. It was whole families, parents, kids, even grandparents, helping themselves to her pool like it was a public park. She'd come outside to find inflatable rafts bobbing in the water, snack wrappers on her table, and discarded flip-flops lining the edge of the deck. Margaret tried to handle it diplomatically. She left polite notes taped to the gate. "Private property. Please do not enter." She spoke to a few parents on the street, making it clear she wasn't comfortable with uninvited guests. It made no difference. One afternoon, she spotted a mother lounging on one of her patio chairs, sunglasses on, scrolling through her phone while her kids splashed and screamed in her pool. Margaret walked up to her, calm but firm. "Excuse me, you're in my backyard." The woman barely looked up. "Oh, I know. The kids just wanted to cool off. We'll be out soon." Margaret clenched her jaw. "That's not the point. You didn't ask." The woman finally took off her sunglasses, looking at Margaret as if she was the one being rude. "It's just a pool," she said with a shrug. "You're not even using it." Margaret felt something tighten in her chest. The audacity, the entitlement, as if her space, her property, was somehow up for grabs just because she wasn't out here every day. She took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "It's my pool, and I'd like you to leave." The woman scoffed, but gathered her things, calling her kids out of the water with an exaggerated sigh. "You really don't have to be so uptight," she muttered under her breath. Margaret didn't respond. She didn't have to. She just stood there, watching as they collected their belongings and slipped through the gate. The same gate they had left wide open, as if they'd be right back. That was when she knew. Being polite wasn't going to work, and things were only going to get worse. But Margaret had a plan, and soon her neighbors would realize just how wrong they were to take advantage of her kindness. Margaret tried everything, and she meant everything. She put up a larger sign on the fence, this time in bold red letters. "Private property. No trespassing." Someone ripped it down within 2 days. She installed a new lock on the gate. The next morning she found it hanging open, broken. She even called the non-emergency police line, hoping an officer's presence might deter them. But when the officer arrived, all he did was shrug. "It's a civil matter, ma'am. If you catch them in the act, you can file a report." Catch them? Wasn't that the problem? She didn't want to spend her afternoons lurking behind curtains, waiting for the next entitled family to waltz in like they owned the place. She was 72 years old, not some security guard, but her patience? That was running out fast. One evening, she sat on her porch, watching the sunset, trying to shake off the frustration. Then, out of the corner of her eye, movement. Across the fence, she saw a boy, no older than 10, climbing over with the ease of someone who had done it many times before. He landed with a soft thud, glanced around, then whistled. And just like that, 2 more kids followed. Margaret felt her hands grip the armrest of her chair. Unbelievable. She cleared her throat loudly. The kids froze mid-step. "You might as well go ahead and finish what you're doing," she said, her voice sharp, "since you clearly think you live here." The smallest one, maybe 7, actually had the nerve to smile. "Our mum said it's fine," he chirped. Margaret narrowed her eyes. Did she now? The oldest one, probably the ringleader, shifted uncomfortably. "We'll just be a minute." "No," she said, pushing herself up from her chair. "You'll leave now." For once, they actually listened. The boys scrambled back over the fence, disappearing into the neighbor's yard. But Margaret didn't feel triumphant. She felt angry, not at the kids. They were just doing what they were allowed to do. It was the parents, the people who should have known better, the same ones who had ignored her notes, brushed off her complaints, and treated her property like it was their right. But she wasn't done yet, not by a long shot, because the real breaking point was still coming. And after that, there'd be no going back. The heat that day was unbearable, the kind that made the air feel thick, pressing down on everything. Margaret had spent the morning running errands, picking up groceries and really trying, to ignore the growing irritation that had settled deep in her chest. She just wanted to come home, unload her bags, and sit in the shade with a cold glass of lemonade. But the moment she pulled into her driveway, she knew peace was not on today's agenda. Music, loud music, laughter, splashing, the distinct sound of children shrieking with joy. Margaret's hands tightened on the steering wheel. She stared at her house, her backyard, her space, and yet it looked nothing like her own. Through the gaps in the fence, she saw it. Dozens of people. Not just a few kids sneaking in for a quick dip. Full families. There were coolers lined up along her patio, as if someone had organized a picnic. A grill was smoking. Pool floats bobbed in the water, some occupied by parents too comfortable, 2 at home. And right in the middle of it all, a woman, the same one Margaret had confronted weeks ago, reclining on one of her chairs, sipping from a plastic cup, as if this was her personal backyard retreat. Margaret sat in her car for a moment, just breathing. This was beyond disrespectful. This was brazen. She grabbed her grocery bags, took her time walking up the steps, and when she pushed open her back door, not a single person even noticed her. That was the part that stung the most. Not the music, not the mess, not the kids trampling over her flower beds. It was the complete lack of acknowledgement, as if she was the outsider. She set her bags down with more force than necessary. The sound wasn't enough to break through the chaos outside, so she stepped forward, until she was standing right at the edge of her patio. "Excuse me." No one turned. She took another step, her voice louder. "I said, excuse me." Finally, a few heads turned. The music continued blaring, but at least some people had the decency to look startled. The woman in the chair sighed, setting down her drink as if she was being inconvenienced. "Oh, hey, Margaret." Margaret stared. "Hey." That's all she had to say. Margaret looked around at the people, the strangers, in her backyard, still floating, still eating, still acting as if nothing was wrong. Something inside her snapped. "You need to get out. All of you." The woman sat up, adjusting her sunglasses. "Come on, it's just a little fun. No harm, no foul." Margaret let out a short, humorless laugh. "No harm? You broke my lock. You ignored my signs. You treated my home like a public park." The woman shrugged. "It's a hot day." Margaret's pulse pounded in her ears. She turned to the others, her voice sharp, commanding. "I'm not asking again. Get out." Finally, people started moving. The kids climbed out of the pool, towels dragging behind them. The adults, grumbling but at least moving, began packing up their coolers, tossing plastic cups into trash bags. As the crowd filtered out, Margaret stood her ground, watching, waiting. She knew this wasn't the end of it. She knew, even as the last person walked out and the gate clicked shut behind them, that the disrespect wouldn't stop here. But Margaret had already made up her mind. This was the last time anyone would set foot in her pool, and tomorrow she was going to make damn sure of that. Margaret barely slept that night. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the scene over and over. The way they had laughed off her anger, dismissed her boundaries, acted like she was being unreasonable for wanting control over her own home. She had tried. She had really tried. Politeness, warnings, even getting the police involved. Nothing worked. And that's when it hit her. The problem wasn't just the neighbors, it was the pool. As long as it was there, sparkling, inviting, a symbol of summer indulgence, people would keep coming. They'd keep finding excuses, keep ignoring her, keep taking. So she'd take something from them. By morning, Margaret had already made the call. The guy on the other end of the line sounded confused. "You wanna get rid of it? Entirely?" "That's right," Margaret said. A long pause. "Ma'am, do you know how much work that's gonna be?" Margaret smiled for the first time in days. "More than breaking my lock? More than ignoring my signs? More than treating me like I don't exist?" Another pause, then a chuckle. "Fair enough. We can start tomorrow." That was all she needed to hear. Margaret spent the rest of the day sitting on her porch, sipping her coffee, waiting. She didn't have to wait long. By noon, her neighbor, the woman who had lounged in her chair like she paid the mortgage, leaned over the fence. "You're getting work done?" Margaret nodded. "Sure am." The woman squinted, spotting the orange tape marking the edges of the pool. "What kind of work?" Margaret took another sip of coffee. Didn't say a word. By afternoon, the questions turned into rumors. Someone saw her talking to a contractor. Someone else noticed a cement truck scheduled for delivery. And by nightfall, the woman from next door finally came knocking. Margaret opened the door, keeping her expression neutral. "You're not actually—" The woman hesitated. "You're not getting rid of the pool, are you?" Margaret tilted her head. "Why do you care?" The woman scoffed, crossing her arms. It's such a nice feature. A lot of us enjoy it." Margaret let that sit for a moment. A lot of us. Not you. Not me. Us. "Exactly," Margaret said finally. "And that's the problem." She shut the door before the woman could reply. Margaret knew this decision wasn't going to be popular. She also didn't care. Because by this time tomorrow, her backyard would no longer be their playground, and she was going to make damn sure of that. By sunrise, the real show had begun. The first truck pulled up just after 8, a flatbed carrying demolition equipment. Half an hour later, a second one arrived, this time with a crew of workers in reflective vests and hard hats. They moved with purpose, unloading tools, prepping the site. Margaret sat on her porch, arms crossed, watching. She wasn't the only one. The neighbors had gathered. First a few, then more. People peered out from behind curtains, lingered on driveways, some even standing in their yards pretending to water their grass just to get a better look. And then, the woman from next door appeared. She stormed across the lawn, her sandals slapping against the pavement. "What the hell is this?" Margaret didn't even blink. "Construction. You're actually doing it." The woman's voice pitched higher, disbelief dripping from every word. "You're really tearing out the pool?" Margaret took a slow sip of her coffee. "I thought you said it was just a pool." The woman's jaw tightened. "You're overreacting." Margaret just smiled. Maybe, but she didn't move, didn't argue, didn't explain herself, because the decision was already made. And now it was too late to stop it. The first sound of machinery roared to life. A jackhammer cracked through the morning silence, splitting the tile into jagged pieces. The woman flinched. The other neighbors watched in stunned silence. Someone murmured, "She's actually doing it." Damn right she was. The destruction was quick, merciless. By mid-morning, the once pristine blue water had been drained, leaving behind an ugly, empty crater. The workers wasted no time, shoveling, breaking apart, hauling debris away. Margaret watched every second of it, and she savored it. By noon, the complaints started trickling in. Someone, probably the woman next door, called the HOA. Didn't matter. Margaret had checked the rules. Nothing prohibited her from removing a pool on her own property. Another neighbor had the nerve to say, "But that pool was a staple of the community." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Funny. I don't remember putting in a community pool." And just like that, the argument died. Because what could they say? They had trespassed. They had ignored her warnings. They had pushed her too far. And now they were paying the price. By sunset, the final truck rolled in. And instead of a pool, Margaret's backyard was now a smooth, flat slab of fresh concrete. No more water, no more lounge chairs, no more pool parties, and most importantly, no more uninvited guests. But Margaret wasn't done yet, because the best part was still coming. The next morning, Margaret stepped outside with her coffee and took a deep breath. For the first time in months, her backyard was quiet. No splashing, no music, no uninvited guests. Just her, exactly the way it should be. She ran her hand over the smooth concrete, still fresh from the day before. Some people would have seen an empty space, a loss. But Margaret? She saw freedom. Of course, the neighbors weren't happy. Some still grumbled when they saw her. Others threw pointed looks in her direction, as if trying to shame her for what she had done. It didn't work. Because, funny enough, no one actually had the guts to say anything to her face. They all knew. They knew they had crossed a line. And they knew deep down that they had only themselves to blame. A few days later, Margaret was planting roses along the edge of her new patio when she heard someone approach. She didn't have to look up to know who it was. The woman from next door cleared her throat. So, what are you going to do with it? Margaret dusted the soil off her hands, then stood up. Haven't decided, she said, glancing over the space. Maybe a garden, maybe a nice fire pit. Whatever I want, really. The woman shifted her weight. You know, the kids are really disappointed. Margaret turned to her, expression unreadable. Oh? She said, voice even. And where were the kids when my signs went ignored? When my locks were broken? When my property was treated like a free-for-all? The woman had no answer for that. Instead, she just exhaled sharply, shaking her head as if Margaret was the unreasonable one. And then, without another word, she walked away. Margaret watched her go, then turned back to her work. She wasn't angry anymore. She wasn't even bitter. She had learned something. People will take what they can get away with. They will push, overstep, and test the limits of your kindness. And if you don't stop them, they'll just keep pushing. Margaret had spent months waiting for them to respect her space. But in the end, she had to take that respect back for herself. She knelt down, pressing a rosebush into the dirt, smiling to herself. She might not have a pool anymore, but what she had now was so much better, because it was hers, and only hers. Have you ever dealt with entitled neighbors? How did you handle it? Tell us your story in the comments. And if you enjoyed this, don't forget to like and subscribe for more unbelievable real-life stories.